Welcome to the 8th Annual Fans Conference. My name is Jay Bennett. I am the chair of this organization, and today I'll be facilitating this Zoom meeting where we have the inimitable Helen McCarthy,
Hi, guys.
world-renowned anime scholar and cosplay historian, presenting on the history of cosplay.
Well, after that very kind invitation, what can I say? I suppose I ought to tell you a little about me. I'm an independent scholar, and I'm honored to be asked to give this presentation again at Fans. This is a work in progress for me, and it's been updated because cosplay research is becoming more rigorous and is becoming more detailed and happily also more inclusive. To give you a little background on how I got here, I cosplayed my first convention in 1974, but long before that, I was recreating historical dress. My mother told me that I started making historic dress for my dolls when I was about 3 years old. And for some years, I had a side gig as a professional costumer. I started researching cosplay because I'd read some claims about it that I thought were jingoistic, verging on cultural colonization. And I personally knew these claims to be untrue, but I had to gather hard evidence to refute them in scholarly circles, because in most scholarly circles, a Japanese friend told me doesn't actually cut it as hard evidence. I still make costume. I love it. I love to study its history. I love to wear it. Sadly, I've never costumed at an Acon or a Fans because it's just too bulky to carry across from the UK. But let's leave me and talk about my favorite subject. The first version of this presentation was made over a decade ago in response to this online comment: America invented cosplay. Some respectable American fan costuming sources believe this sincerely, and I found it completely untenable. Because first of all, the word cosplay was coined in Japan in the early 1980s. And secondly, I'd seen photos of cosplaying friends in Japan dating from the late 1970s. But these sources, which I respected and to an extent still respect, stated that the concept was imported from America after Japanese fans visited the 1984 LA Worldcon. That statement doesn't stand up to available contemporary evidence. Not only does the basic idea of cosplay, taking on another character for symbolic or personal reasons, long predate the colonization of America, but the act of cosplaying at public events and fan conventions was established before the 20th century began and outside either America or Japan. For religious purposes, the Japanese, like many other ancient peoples, including the First Nations of the Americas, have been dressing up to represent magical and natural forces since time immemorial. Incidentally, in England, time immemorial is before the reign of Richard I, since when the legal status of time immemorial was set, nobody was expected to remember back before then. But I believe we can't actually understand the history of cosplay in Japan, or any earlier misconceptions about it, without understanding the history of human culture with cosplay before the word was invented. The tradition of dressing up to represent or embody a character, a god, a shaman, a force of nature, was a means of accessing qualities that individuals and communities really needed. And that is very, very ancient. In many traditions, including the Celtic tradition and the Egyptian tradition, priests and shamans wore animal pelts or animal heads or tattooed themselves with animal designs to strengthen their rituals and call on the powers of animal spirits. Ancient Egyptian gods assumed animal or half-animal forms, so their priests naturally wore ritual masks in animal form to call down the qualities of the gods for the benefit of their community. So this key component of town fairs and parties and science fiction and fantasy and conventions goes right back into the earliest days of humanity's history, when people all over the world made ritual masks and took on the personae of animals and spirits and gods and heroes. It was all about getting in touch with higher powers, influencing the course of life, and expanding the individual's consciousness, definitely for the benefit of the tribe, but also for the individual's personal growth, knowledge, and power. It's about control. It's about self-enrichment in both the good and bad sense. And it's definitely about appropriation. Because one thing we see looking at ancient masks and rituals is how many of them pick up on the same motifs and the same themes. And so as scholars, even if we're purely looking at cosplay, we can't really investigate where cosplay came from, where cosplay originated, without at least considering its intersections with global history, global imperialism, race, faith, anthropology, psychology, and media. Ancient peoples like the Ainu, the early Yayoi peoples in Japan, the sophisticated civilizations of ancient Africa and the Indian subcontinent, and the peoples of the Arctic, they're all part of the prehistory of cosplay. And without understanding the prehistory, we're not going to get far with the history. So as history went on and humans formed bigger, more settled communities, that impulse to use costume and role play to get in touch with higher consciousness didn't die away. After all, it had been more or less, to their minds, proved to work by their forefathers. And the medieval mystery plays performed all over Europe continued this impulse to connect with spiritual power through reenactment. Some mystery cycles are still formed today, most famously the Passion Play at Oberammergau in Austria, in Bavaria, I beg your pardon, and the Chester Mystery Cycle in England. Walking in the footsteps of religious characters, assuming their identity, reenacting their lives, is transformed into a public act of prayer. It's a repeated affirmation of belief that these stories matter to humans on a deep level. For the past decade, a Christian group has performed the Passion of Christ and the Nativity all over the UK, with a Passion Play in London every year since 2010, a revival of the medieval tradition. So cosplay is part of that same diverse and ancient spiritual tradition. But the European Reformation disapproved of dressing up. The reformers saw it as idolatrous superstition, and I think they probably also feared its transformative power and its authority. Later, as the Age of Enlightenment swept through Europe, only rural peasant communities took the old traditions seriously, but even sophisticated city people still found dressing up had a lot of uses. There were secret societies like the Hellfire Club, with arcane rituals carried out in masks, and there was carnival across Europe, still surviving to this day in Venice, where people masked and disguised their clothing with enveloping cloaks called dominoes. And this disguise let them pursue political and sexual intrigue without the risk of being identified. The masks worn by highwaymen originated in carnival masquerade and had the same purpose, the concealing of the original identity to assume the role of brigand while retaining that ordinary safe identity to scoot back to as a law-abiding person. Mask balls and costume balls became hugely popular in 18th and 19th century Europe. Queen Victoria and her husband Prince Albert gave 3 famous costumed balls at Buckingham Palace. The medieval ball, in which they cosplayed King Edward III of England and his Queen Philippa of Hainaut, who was believed to be Britain's first Black Queen because she has mixed race ancestry. Then there was the Stuart Ball and the Restoration Ball. And you can still see Queen Victoria's beautiful costume from the Restoration Ball here on screen at Buckingham Palace. That's still preserved and it goes on display occasionally. Many other balls were held in England, either as private parties, because it became very chic to have costume balls, a way of parading your literary and historical knowledge, or else to raise money for charity, with costumes ranging from historical figures and fantasy folk such as fairies and elves, to characters from literature and characters from everyday life. London chimney sweeps were a very popular costume for wealthy young gentlemen with not much better to do than cover themselves in soot and laugh and drink too much. So, as we said, costume balls were popular across Europe. And in 1877, we see the first example of science fiction and fantasy cosplay at a public event dedicated entirely to fiction. In other words, convention cosplay. Jules Verne was a hugely popular French author and is renowned as one of the fathers of modern science fiction, but this would also make him the father of the science fiction convention, because in Amiens in France in 1877, he gave a party, a bal travesty, as the French called it, a travesty dance, a dress-up ball, open to all his fans. So you could pay and go to this ball and see Monsieur Verne and express your love of his characters in exactly the same way as you do at a modern convention. Attendees dressed up as characters or mechanical items from both his SF and non-SF works. And you can see the newspaper Le Monde Illustré presented several spreads, of which this is one, reporting and giving drawings, because these were in the days before regular photogravure in newspapers, of the event. So here we have the earliest documented evidence of a convention, a science fiction convention. Here we have the earliest documented evidence of cosplay at a convention. And because they're cosplaying Verne characters, this is the earliest documented evidence of media cosplay to date. And if you find evidence for an earlier convention cosplay or a convention or media cosplay, please share it, because nobody is really working on this aspect of cosplay as far as I know. And there's a clutch of wonderful doctoral dissertations waiting to be written around Jules Verne and the context in which he had the first science fiction convention. Now, it was 1891 before Britain got in on the SF Convention Act, but we did it in style. Our venue was a site of major cultural significance, the Royal Albert Hall itself. And in fact, the Royal Albert Hall website makes the claim that many people considered this to be the first science fiction convention. I'm not sure we can discount Verne's evidence so quickly, but this convention was a charity gig, like so many of the masquerade balls of the time. Herbert Tibbets, who founded the London Massage and Galvanic Hospital, put together a committee made up of titled ladies and ornaments of society, the British establishment's equivalent of fan dignitaries and Worldcon committees, to raise funds for his school and for the London West End Hospital. And they organised events, including this 1891 fundraiser, based on Edward Bulwer Lytton's 1871 book, The Coming Race, which was a huge hit and a massive seller. There were many such events, as noted in the London press when they were recording this one, but this one was the only one specifically based on a best-selling SFF novel. The book featured a race called the Vrilya, a race powered by a mysterious energy called Vril, and their human admirers were invited to gather with them and celebrate in London. Fancy dress was absolutely encouraged. The convention book, because the Royal Albert Hall still has the convention book, shows that the Vrilya were invited to gather and celebrate in London. People were actively invited, not merely to dress up and socialize as at a fancy dress ball, but to step into the world of the Vrilya, to become the Vrilya. Queen Victoria's own costumers, makers of the outfits worn at her Buckingham Palace balls, supplied costumes based on the book. I'm very impressed that one young lady interpreted the heroine, Princess Z, in a black satin gown and tiara adorned with electric lights. It was going to be quite some time before a 20th century convention incorporated wiring into costume. But there it was in 1891 in London. And there was a dealer's area. There was at least one active sponsor, makers of a new drink called Bovril, which is still available and popular in Britain today. And there were concerts and there were other entertainments. Now, some scholars argue that Verne's 1877 ball in France was missing some of the elements that we now regard as vital parts of a convention. I don't think it's entirely fair to retrofit our view of a convention onto Verne's when it has so many elements. But one might say that Amiens 1877 was possibly the world's first public SFF cosplay, but it wasn't a convention. But any scholar who chooses to argue that the 1891 Albert Hall gig was not in every respect a science fiction convention with cosplay must provide very sound evidence. Personally, I accept both events as conventions, and therefore I argue that Amiens 1877 is both the first documented science fiction convention, the first convention cosplay, and also the first media character cosplay, and that London 1891 is second in all three categories. Now, the first documented US media cosplay was in 1908. when Mr. and Mrs. William Fell attended a skating rink masquerade party as Mr. Skygack from Mars and Miss Dill Pickles, who were popular comic strip characters of the day. So by my reckoning, this is the third worldwide example of a documented media cosplay. The third documented SF convention cosplay was by Morojo, aka Myrtle Rebecca Douglas, who made Futuri costumes for herself and her then boyfriend, Forrest J. Ackerman, to wear at the 1939 New York Worldcon. This is where many writers on cosplay start the origin of convention cosplay. But if you're following my timeline, this makes the 1939 Worldcon the third documented SFF convention, and Morojo's cosplay the fourth documented convention cosplay and media cosplay. Her costumes were based on pulp artwork around the 1936 film Things to Come. So we're already getting some good solid evidence there that cosplay was embedded into culture in Europe at European conventions before they were described as such. Some researchers are also, oh goodness, my word, I'm being asked to join a live Zoom demo, that's fun. But some researchers are also not aware that America was very, very cosplay negative in the early days. If you want to know what early Americans thought of masquerade balls and costume parties, you've only to read some of the comments in the press from the late 1700s, early 1800s. These, of course, are the same sort of hidebound old moralists who nowadays would complain about long hair on guys and short skirts on girls, but they reflect a very strong strand of American settler culture that looked down on any trace of non-white, non-Christian or cross-cultural influence. It's a further reminder that we can't properly understand cosplay outside its historical context. But this gradually changed, and here are some examples from the American press about the West Point hops. Cadets from West Point Military Academy were invited to regular hops given by local young ladies at Cozzens Hotel. And some of them, as we know from the New York Times and other papers, this comment in 1865, another in 1859, many of these were fancy dress hops. And the papers reported favorably on the costume balls and complimented young ladies on the ingenuity of their outfits. So here the Anglo-Saxon Protestant American settler culture is softening towards the idea of masquerade and guising and costuming. The very things, the very irreligious influences they fled Europe to avoid. But it wasn't due to a change of heart or attitude in the master race, at least not initially. It was due to 150 years of underground cross-cultural influence that began with French settlers who originally owned Louisiana, Native Americans, and Black slaves. It developed by transforming a public display of high spirits into a form of radical protest through costume and performance. Today, we call it Carnival in London, and you call it Mardi Gras in the US, and it is most definitely one of world cosplay's nurturing aunties. The first Mardi Gras was actually held in 1699 by the original settlers near what would become New Orleans, though some sources cite the first true Mardi Gras in Mobile, Alabama. French authorities, who at the time were in control in the area, actually gave slaves time off work, and they allowed them to earn their own money and save their own money. In fact, time off could be to celebrate festivals, or it could be to earn money to buy their freedom, which the French accepted as a perfectly natural thing for slaves to want to do and quite legitimate and okay. So Black people were active in costuming from the beginning. And again, there's so little work done on this and I'm hungry to know more about it. But were any of those early costumers Black? It seems very likely. They worked with their hands and they wanted to earn extra money. Not just were any of the cosplayers Black, but were they supplying other cosplayers? Today's Mardi Gras Indian crews are a tribute to the days when Native Americans would hide and assist escaping slaves, because when the Louisiana Purchase took place and when America acquired all that land, obviously slaves didn't have the same levels of freedom that the French were prepared to give them. I've also read very occasional references to 19th and early 20th century costume balls among the affluent Black American community. And I think for someone who's prepared to do a lot of digging into local newspapers and Black community records back there, there's a wonderful topic waiting, but it's really a topic that belongs to a Black scholar and cosplayer, and one that I don't feel qualified to take away from them. So we finally got to the 20th century in Europe and Canada and the USA, with a rich mix of religious, spiritual, and historical tradition distilled down to that central idea of putting on a costume and assuming another identity to express yourself, to connect with your psyche, to escape from reality for a short while, to have fun, to show off your craft and performance skills, to come together as a community, or to rebel. These are the traditions I know best. And I won't presume to go deeply into the influences behind cosplay and the many African, Asian, and Pacific traditions, because I have no expertise in these areas. But I can say a little about the Japanese tradition because I've spent some time on researching it and have been guided by many kind friends and mentors who know it better than I do. Japanese Shinto and Buddhist ritual involves elaborate and beautiful costumes, masks, music, and dance. Classical Japanese theatre, no, kabuki, and bunraku puppetry have a deep and rich tradition of masks that signal the characters and costumes that send many subtle cues to an audience versed in their lore, while still being enjoyable for less educated audiences. But there are also extensive foreign influences on Japanese fashion and Japanese art, both from China and Korea in Japan's medieval history, and from Europe in 16th century and 19th century Japan. Japanese people echoed Chinese dress and Korean dress, and for a brief while, Western dress was also a big fashion influence. In fact, before Japan closed its borders to outsiders, you could see young Christian Japanese cosplaying Europeans. That was quite interesting. At the same time, Japanese cloth and ceramic experts to the West, after the close down, began to influence Western clothes. Last year, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London had a wonderful exhibition devoted to kimono, and you can still get hold of the book of the show, packed with history on how Japan and the West influenced each other from the 1600s on. And all this fed into Japan's fashion, but also Japan's ideas about what was permissible and possible in dress. It encouraged those Japanese who could afford it to start, as we would say, cosplaying foreigners, assuming thereby the aura of sophistication and technical advance that foreigners possessed. Japan's long isolation from the West ended in 1855 and led to a huge influx of Western manners, customs, and dress. And once again, the influence went both ways, of course. Europe and America went crazy for Japanese fashion and art, and a huge number of affluent Japanese once again began cosplaying as Westerners. This affected all kinds of people and occupations, because although the very poor stayed with kimono because it was what they could afford, and most women continued to wear traditional clothes for formal occasions until the Pacific War. Only young and rebellious girls adopted the moga, modern girl look, short hair, short clothes, makeup, and cigarettes. Modern boys were also much in evidence. They were all consciously looking to find an identity in the new Japan through the clothes they wore. The first cosplay in Japan, in the sense of the adoption of the role and costume of a character from popular culture, seems to have been informal and emerging, as so many things do, from children's play. Leiji Matsumoto talks in several interviews about cosplaying a popular manga character called Makoto with school friends soon after World War II, or about running around with a cape made from a towel, possibly costuming the world's first superhero, All Gone Bat, hugely popular from 1930 and pictured here, still being cosplayed in the 20th century. But unlike the USA, Japan was too poor after the Pacific War for most people to dress up for fun, and certainly too poor to start having science fiction conventions. There was hunger and there was desperate poverty. Respectably brought up girls turned to prostitution with allied servicemen to keep their families fed. Family treasures such as swords and kimono were sold to the occupying forces. It wasn't until the early 70s, as Japan's economy grew more stable, that we start to see the first documented reports of cosplay, both at formal public events and at student parties and gatherings. The earliest documentary evidence of a formal convention costume event I've found so far was at Miyacon in 1974. Now, fair enough, that's quite late in the day by comparison with American, British, French conventions, but it's 10 years ahead of the 1984 Los Angeles Worldcon. A fan recorded at the time online that Yoshio Aramaki's costume show was the first time he'd seen a costume show at a convention, and he had high hopes that they would continue. Costumes and skits featured included Hoshizora, Captain Future, Planet of the Apes versus the Japan Apaches, Captain America, and Superman. I've yet to find any photos from that convention, but God, I would love to. In addition, Yamato, Space Battleship Yamato, fan club members were photographed cosplaying at the 1976 Winter Comiket and the Christmas Manga Festival. Nov Takahashi, who was part of the group who coined the word cosplay, talks about the Grand Manga March Parade, a parade held by students of the Big Five universities in Tokyo, starting from a shopping center in Mito City in Ibaraki Prefecture in 1977. And he's corroborated that online. I've never seen any photographs of the parade, but Takahashi names two Seikosha publishers, monthly magazines at the time that covered costuming. Manpa, which ran from 1976 to 77, and Dax from 1977 to 78. In 1978, at the Japanese National Convention, Ashinokon, critic and novelist Mari Kotani appeared as part of a group cosplaying Edgar Rice Burroughs' Fighting Men of Mars, although her costume was mistaken. This costume here, the red cloak and the white, it was mistaken for a very similar costume, which you can see next to it, in Tezuka's Triton of the Sea. And for a long time, and with various documentary miscues in Japanese popular press as opposed to fan press, it was assumed that Triton of the Sea was the first character cosplayed in Japan. But Mangakai Pongi Bang, there looking utterly charming as Lum, cosplayed as Lum as a teenager from around 1980. Gekkan Out magazine had a cosplay special issue in 1979, and Fan Road magazine ran a feature on cosplay in its first issue in August 1980. All of this is documented and the evidence can be accessed online, often in English. Edmund W. Hoff and Tim Eldred have both done superlative work on accessing and sharing early cosplay records in Japanese magazines. Now, the early coverage of cosplay in the now defunct Manpa and Dax was picked up by new anime magazines Gekkan Out, with its cosplay special issue in 79, and Fan Road in 1980. And Ed Hoff, who is a cosplay scholar and bidding to be a cosplay scholar of great distinction, in my opinion, talks about this in his essay in the book I co-edited on Leiji Matsumoto, co-edited with Dr. Darren John Ashmore, and visible there on screen. It's an excellent essay and it gives wonderful pointers for anyone wanting to explore the background documentation of Japanese cosplay in the 70s and 80s. So we have evidence that by the mid-70s to 80s, cosplay in Japan at SF conventions and other events was well established. Public events like Comiket, though not always welcoming to costumers, had become regular places for them to gather, and there were many local events where they could wear costume. There is American media influence on costumes in that American originated characters were cosplayed alongside Japanese ones, but there is no evidence that American influence started cosplay in Japan, or that American cosplayers were the first people to wear anime cosplay, another untenable claim I've heard. In the 1970s and 1980s, an enduring trend, we can see it to this day, develops. A wildly popular show or game character will be cosplayed at every event, everywhere, often multiple times, until replaced by the next big thing. But devoted fans will carry on cosplaying their favorite characters for years. Based on the evidence we have, Triton of the Sea was the first big craze, and you could still buy Triton commercial cosplay outfits online in the late 2010s. Space Battleship Yamato followed as a huge craze, and Ed Hoff points to a 1979 article where Yamato cosplayers are already described as living fossils. Think about that. By 1979, Yamato cosplay was so out of date. Gundam in 1979 and Macross in 1982 both had big cosplay followings in Japan. And of course, by the late 80s, early 90s, with anime awareness spreading in the West, certainly where I am in Britain, every convention had at least one or two Lum cosplayers. One of them would probably be a guy cross-playing, dressing as a character out of their gender. And there were always at least two or three Ranma Nibunoichi characters. In France, the giant robot shows were hugely popular from the moment they began to hit the screen in 1978. Commercial masks and costumes were available for children, and fans were able to adopt and adapt their own. Now, of course, in Japan, as we can see from looking at these wonderful pictures, there's a much wider range of of characters cosplayed, because Western fans didn't see as much varied anime as Japanese fans did. But fans also cosplayed characters from other nations with great enthusiasm, as you can see from that lovely Batman and Robin up there. These are images from 1980 from Fan Road. And looking at Fan Road in 1980, it's fairly easy to confirm that both fan-made and commercial costumes are around. And the commercial ones were often used for events and promotions by companies either connected with the anime involved or keen to monetize the growing popularity of anime. But many of these costumes are personally made, and they're an example of a fabulous costuming culture, a real vibrant, dynamic, happy, confident, widespread, well-established costuming culture at the end of the 70s and in the 80s. For a long time, this was considered to be the first use of the word cosplay. And it's only Ed Hoff's research that has enabled us to realize that it was in use in Japanese magazine reports on cosplay for at least a year or two prior to this. Those reports all involve Nof Takahashi or his friends, and so their claim to have coined the word cosplay, I think, is good. But this was their first big, solid, non-cosplay magazine use of the word. My Anime magazine, 1983, popular magazine, a good magazine, and proclaiming cosplay. As you can see, again, in 1983, as in 1980, as in 1979, we've got a very diverse cosplay community doing a huge range of popular TV shows. Lupin the Third, all manner of wonderful, wonderful things there. Japanese cosplayers, skilled, full of inventiveness, not derivative of any other nation's traditions, but cosplaying their own favorite characters with technical skill and enthusiasm, and much, much background history. If you have a look at the following spread and page, because this was a big deal. This was a 5-page article in a major magazine by 3 young writers just starting out. You can actually see, if you look at the box out at the bottom of the final page, how to build mecha suits. They say sweet, but it's mecha suits. That's hardly a topic for a beginning fandom. You can see the katakana for cosplay just below the Act 3 heading on the same page, in bold on the second column, reading in from the right. And the cosplay photo notice at the bottom of the same page, page 110. Cosplay is here, is established, not just the word, but the fact, and is powerful and strong as a tradition in Japan. Why? Well, if you think about it, all these young people, like many people at conventions all over the world, are starting out on their journey to find themselves. And what did we say that cosplay gives us in spiritual, in ritual, in historic, in psychological terms? It gives us the ability to find ourselves in another larger and more powerful identity, a more established identity, to try on these identities till we see which one fits, to emulate the characters we admire in the hope of drawing down for ourselves, for our cosplay tribe, for our fan community, those qualities into ourselves. People cosplay characters they love, not just because they look cool, but because they want to take something from those characters that they value, because they want to be able to say, I admire X and Y for these attributes, and I'm going to embody X and Y, portray X and Y as well as I can. And in so doing, I will hopefully not only show these attributes to other people, but absorb more of them into myself. The psychological, spiritual aspect of cosplay is so important that it's hard to express. Since 1983, in fact, as we now know, since well before that, but certainly since the word was coined, cosplay in Japan has gone from strength to strength. And at the same time, it's become a major global cultural phenomenon. Cosplay has literally changed lives. And I've had several personal conversations with cosplayers and can confirm that in some cases, in these cases, cosplay has also saved their lives. It's given people a way back in to a society that they felt was not for them and was not interested in them, and has enabled them to integrate in ways that none of the other tools they were offered have been able to let them do. It's enabled many people to start creative businesses. It's enabled many people to express their inner selves. It's enabled them to build new skills, make new friends, learn new ways of socializing, sharing, supporting within a community. These are all skills that I'm sure everybody here looks for in their students. The skills of a good cosplayer, whether as a crafter or as a model, are skills that help to make model scholars. The first World Cosplay Summit, this picture was taken from the World Cosplay Summit, let's see, 2016, I believe, was held in Nagoya in 2003. And even then, even when it was just starting out, it didn't just have Japanese cosplayers. They included cosplayers from Germany, Italy, and France. Otherwise, in their view, how could they call it the World Cosplay Summit? A TV documentary on it was broadcast in Japan, and obviously American fans who had good links with Japan through all the military bases there picked up on this, and a USA delegation joined the competition the following year, 2004. By 2006, 9 countries were represented, and another documentary appeared on Japanese TV. Every year, more nations joined the contest as more nations began to pick up on the joy and energy of cosplay. And every year, more interest was generated by the media around the world. Now, all of us know who've been in any fandom, all you've got to do is stick somebody out there in a costume and you can attract a crowd of reporters instantly, because it's great pictures, and great pictures sell media. But what was interesting about the movement towards cosplay is that as anime and manga spread through the world, so did the idea that you could use it in a transformative fashion, that you could take its characters and make them your own through cosplaying them. And that became enormously popular. In 2019, the last year of physical competition was held, 40 countries were represented. Obviously, there's an issue around representation here, and there's an issue around privilege here, in that you have to be able to afford to get into cosplay. But one of the axioms that long-standing cosplayers will tell you is that you can throw time at a costume, or you can throw money at a costume and get a great result from either of those. If you can throw both at a costume, you'll get a superlative result. More countries are joining. Cosplayers from poorer nations are in fact being helped by cosplayers from richer nations. And that is a wonderful thing to see. In 2020, a 24-hour global broadcast of past competitions took place because the pandemic made it impossible to hold a World Cosplay Summit. And in 2021, the cosplay was send in video only. So there was still a World Cosplay Summit, but only if you could send your video across. I hope that 2022 will also be a good video contest, but it doesn't look likely at the moment, with the present situation and access to Japan, that it will be possible for cosplayers to get into Japan this year. At present, the rules are that unless you have a business visa or a government visa, or you're traveling with an organized Japanese tour group, JAL or ANA or something similar, you can't get access to Japan. Possibly JAL or ANA will be persuaded to assist by organizing a tour group for the entire World Cosplay Summit, but that we don't know. Possibly in 2023, we will see the World Cosplay Summit again. And I hope so, because alongside its castles, its classical arts, and its natural beauty, cosplay is now part of Japan's contribution to world cultural heritage. They have picked up the Yayoi peoples and the Ainu peoples and the peoples of the world's access to their deep spiritual selves through masquerade. And they've made it something that the modern media can be part of and celebrate and enjoy. From its beginnings in a small country recovering after an economically and socially devastating war, cosplay has gone on to become a source of joy and a source of fun for the whole world. It accesses deep human cultural needs. It links us all to our histories. But above all else, it expresses how we are literally all brothers and sisters under the mask. We're all cosplayers. It's just that cosplayers actually have the guts to go out and wear real masks rather than put them on their general faces. Now, I'm afraid there is no room to include all my references, but here are a few that you may find it useful to include in your own explorations. Please feel free to screen grab, and I know that Fans is going to put this online, so it'll be there for reference. And if you use any of my slides in your own work, please credit me. But please remember above all that to study the history of cosplay, or indeed the history of anything, in only one language, one century, one culture, is to miss the reason for its popularity, that it speaks to something deep and primeval and meaningful in every one of us. Thank you for your attention. Does anyone have any questions?
Now's the time. All right, we are good to go with no questions at this time.
Right,
If anyone has any later, I will refer to them to your Twitter.
please do, and please do, as I say, investigate as far as you can the history of cosplay. A huge thank you and shout out to all of the great scholars that have assisted me with this and that have been mentioned here, but especially Mari Katani, Edmund Hoff, Tim Eldred. I owe you a lot. Thank you very much. Thank you, Fans, and have a great conference.
Once again, folks, this is Helen McCarthy, world-renowned anime scholar and fantastic lady all around.
That's very kind. Have a good rest of the afternoon. Bye.